Section 1. The Ember and the Faucet was a rain-soaked morning in early November when I, Dr. John Watson, was roused from the depths of a particularly satisfying slumber by the sharp clatter of correspondence being delivered to 221 B. Baker Street. The fog outside pressed thick and low against the window panes, turning the gaslight glow into a pale ghost of itself. I had scarcely poured my morning tea when Sherlock Holmes emerged from his bedroom, eyes glinting with unusual alertness, and a letter clutched between his long fingers. "Watson," he said, with the unmistakable cadence of a mind already well into its calculations, "we are summoned to Ravensmoor Hall." "Ravensmoor?" I repeated, stirring a second sugar into my tea. "Never heard of it." "You would not have," Holmes replied, stepping lightly across the room to the fireplace. "It lies on the Devonshire coast, brooding over the cliffs like some forgotten ruin. Until recently, it was the ancestral seat of the Mervyn family. That seat, it seems, has gone up in flames." I set my cup down. "A fire?" "A very peculiar one," Holmes said. "The letter is from Inspector Giles Merton of the local constabulary. He is requesting our presence on behalf of Lady Genevieve Mervyn, the surviving daughter of the late Lord Edgar Mervyn. The manor was destroyed 3 nights ago in a blaze of extraordinary intensity. The fire consumed nearly the entire structure, leaving behind little more than ash and bones." I frowned. "Bones?" Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. 3 charred remains were discovered in what had been the drawing room. 2 male, 1 female. Their identities are as yet uncertain. Surely a tragic accident, but not necessarily. "A case for us." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Inspector Merton seems to believe otherwise. He includes this rather curious detail." He passed me the letter. I scanned the neatly penned lines and paused at the passage Holmes had underlined in ink. "No apparent cause for ignition. No oil lamps, no embers left untended in the hearth. Yet the fire burned hot enough to melt iron fixings. Witnesses claim the flames erupted all at once, without warning, and glowed with an unnatural hue." I looked up. "Spontaneous combustion?" Holmes smirked. "Leave that to the penny dreadfuls, Watson. No. What interests me is the mention of Lady Mervyn's whispers of the family curse. When rational minds invoke superstition, there is usually a very real fear beneath. And so, within 24 hours, we boarded the southbound train from Paddington, bound for the more shadowed coast of Devonshire. The journey was long and uneventful, broken only by Holmes' occasional observations about fellow passengers. The woman in the third carriage with ink-stained fingers and a journal of pressed herbs. The soldier nursing a brandy flask with trembling hands. The conductor with a curious limp he attributed to frostbite, but which, Holmes concluded, was from an improperly set fracture sustained during a fall from a horse dot by the time we arrived at Ravensmoor station. Night had begun to fall. The air held a biting chill, and the faint scent of wood smoke clung to the wind. A waiting carriage met us at the platform, driven by a silent, gaunt man who tipped his hat without a word and gestured us aboard Dot as we rode through the dense woodland and up the winding path toward the cliffs. Holmes sat forward in his seat, the first glimpse of the estate coming into view. Ravensmoor Hall, or what remained of it, was a blackened skeleton against the stormy sky. The great stone archways still stood, but much of the roof had collapsed inward, Scaffolding had been hastily erected, and small figures moved among the ruins like ghosts. Lady Genevieve Mervyn greeted us at what had once been the front vestibule. She was in her early 30s, with auburn hair pinned severely back, her mourning dress heavy and somber. Yet she held herself with a soldier's composure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so swiftly," she said, her voice low but clear. Holmes inclined his head. "You are brave to stand here, Lady Mervyn. Few would choose to linger among the ashes of their inheritance." Her eyes flicked toward the scorched stone. "I do not linger. I wait." "For what?" "For the truth," she said simply. "My father would not have left this world without leaving behind answers." "May we speak privately?" Holmes asked. She led us to the remnants of the old library wing. Though half the shelves were collapsed, the walls had somehow survived. A fire crackled in a temporary grate, the only warmth against the creeping cold. "I have arranged quarters for you in the old carriage house. But please, what is it you wish to know?" "Let us begin at the start," Holmes said. "3 nights ago, tell us everything." Lady Mervyn took a breath. "We were hosting a family dinner. My father, Lord Edgar, my brother Lucien, his business partner, Mr. Nathaniel Corwin, and myself. We had retired to the drawing room after supper. There was some tension. Lucien and my father had argued earlier about estate debts. I left them briefly to attend to a guest room fire that had gone out. When I returned, her hands clenched. The entire room was aflame. The doors buckled from the heat. The servants screamed. I tried to reach them, but it was too late." Holmes studied her expression. "You saw no one else leave the room?" "No one. The fire brigade took nearly half an hour to arrive. By then, there was nothing left. And the remains? 3 bodies. They believe one is my father. Another may be Mr. Corwin. The third," her voice faltered. "Lucien wore a family ring. It was found on one of the corpses, but the features were unrecognizable." Holmes said nothing for a moment, then nodded. "I will require access to the remains, the estate papers, and any surviving correspondence." "Of course." And he added, "I would like to speak to the staff, the housekeeper, the groundsman, any footman still in service." Lady Mervyn hesitated. "Most have left. Only the groundskeeper, Elias, remains. He refused to leave. Says the land remembers." "Superstition again," I muttered. Holmes looked intrigued. "All the better. Superstitions often speak when facts do not." That night, as we settled into the sparse quarters of the carriage house, Holmes sat at the window overlooking the charred bones of Ravensmoor Hall. "The fire," he murmured, "was no accident. And the true question is not how it started, but who wanted it to end this way." He turned to me, the firelight reflecting in his eyes like amber. "Watson, tomorrow we search for a murderer among ashes." Section 2. Echoes beneath the ruins. The following morning broke damp and gray over the Devonshire coast, a thin mist veiling the horizon as though the sea itself wished to hide the secrets that Ravensmoor Hall had kept for centuries. From our temporary lodgings in the old carriage house, I could see the jagged ruins of the manor silhouetted against the moor beyond, blackened walls and scorched chimneys like the bones of a dead leviathan beached upon the cliffs. Holmes had risen early, as was his habit when a mystery stirred his faculties into motion. He stood at the small desk provided in our quarters, sleeves rolled to his forearms, poring over a collection of notes he'd begun assembling the night before. "Watson," he said without looking up, "there is something quite off about Lady Genevieve Mervyn's narrative." "She seemed composed," I replied, fastening the buttons of my waistcoat. "Earnest, even." "Precisely," Holmes said, tapping a pencil against his chin. "Too composed. It is not grief that unsettles me, but her methodical control." She spoke of 3 charred bodies, as if she were listing dinner guests unable to attend. "She is in shock, perhaps. Perhaps. But I think it more likely that she is guarding something. Whether it is her own secret or someone else's remains to be seen." We set out for the ruins just after breakfast, meeting Lady Mervyn near the library wing where she had received us the day prior. Her black dress fluttered faintly in the wind, and she greeted us with the solemn nod of a woman already preparing herself for unpleasant questions. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "Inspector Merton arrived an hour ago. He awaits you at the chapel." The family chapel?" She nodded. "It withstood the fire. The remains have been placed there for temporary interment." We made our way across the grounds, Holmes taking careful note of every scorched path and crumbled archway. A crow cawed harshly from a barren tree, and a hush settled over the estate like a mourning veil. The chapel itself stood a short distance from the main house, its stone exterior blackened but intact, ivy charred at the roots but already showing signs of stubborn regrowth. Inside, the air was cold and still. 3 simple coffins lay upon trestles near the altar, each marked only with the number 1, 2, 3. Inspector Giles Merton. A stout, red-faced man with a well-worn bowler hat stood with arms folded over his chest, chin tucked as though awaiting judgment. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a low voice. "Dr. Watson. A grim business, this." Holmes offered a polite nod. "You received my telegram?" "I did." "The bodies remain untouched, save for the local coroner's examination. No personal effects beyond the ring found on corpse number 2. He gestured toward the center coffin. "The family seal, unmistakable, belonged to Lucien Mervyn." Holmes stepped forward and examined the coffin carefully. He did not open it. Instead, he inspected the exterior, his eyes sharp, hands gliding across the lid with a delicate precision. "Tell me, Inspector," he said, "what did the coroner report regarding the manner of death?" Merton produced a thin folder. "Extensive charring, as you'd expect. But here's the part that confounds him. The burns were near identical across all 3. Same depth, same distribution. As though they had all perished at precisely the same moment." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And where were they found?" "Oh." We fell into silence. Even I, with my medical background, could feel the unnatural suggestion behind Merton's words. 3 people caught unaware by fire might flee, scatter, leave marks of struggle or panic, but to find them gathered still and scorched as one was unnerving. Holmes moved to the side of the chapel and leaned over a stone sarcophagus bearing the Mervyn crest. "Tell me about the family," he said abruptly. Merton cleared his throat. "Old blood. Titles dating back to Edward III. Lord Edgar was the last in the male line, save for Lucien. Their fortune came from sea trade rumors of smuggling during the Napoleonic Wars, though nothing ever proven. Some say the family grew rich through dealings they'd rather history forgot." Holmes's brow arched. And the estate's finances? According to Lady Mervyn, heavily encumbered. Lord Edgar sold off several parcels of land before the fire. Some went to Nathaniel Corwin, Lucian's business partner. Ah, yes, the third victim. That's right. An industrialist from Birmingham. Bit of a brute by all accounts, sharp elbows and sharper debts. Rumor had it he was pressuring Lucian to force the sale of the manor itself. Holmes nodded slowly. And the servants? Gone. Most fled during or immediately after the fire. Only one remains, Elias Finch, the groundskeeper. We must speak with him. You'll find him in the east field, Lady Mervyn said from the chapel doorway. He sleeps in the gardener's shed and refuses to leave the estate. We thanked the inspector and departed the chapel, walking down the lone path through the fields. The air had grown heavier, and a flock of gulls wheeled overhead like sentinels. We found Elias Finch kneeling beside a half-buried rose trellis, his calloused hands clearing away the ash and soot with remarkable care. He looked up as we approached. Lean, wiry man with eyes that had seen far more than they ought to. "You're the detective," he said before Holmes could speak. "I know who you are, and I know why you're here." Holmes gave him a curt nod. "Then you can save us both time, Mr. Finch. Tell me what you know." Elias rose, brushing dust from his knees. "I know the fire weren't natural. Came too fast, too hot. It didn't spread, it exploded. Like the house breathed its last breath in flame. What did you see?" "Nothing. I was in the greenhouse, clear other side of the manor. Heard the roar. Ran to the house and saw it lit up like Judgment Day. But I heard something before that." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Go on." "A bell. The old bell above the hall entrance. It rang once loud and sharp, and then silence. That bell hasn't rung in years." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, make a note. The bell may prove crucial." I scribbled quickly in my journal. "Any reason it might have rung accidentally?" Elias shook his head. "Rope was cut years ago. Rats in the tower, they said. Lady Mervyn had it sealed. And yet it rang," Holmes said softly, "just before the fire." The groundskeeper glanced over his shoulder toward the ruined house. "They say the Mervyns were cursed, that the land itself rejects them. But I don't believe in curses." "What do you believe in?" Elias turned back to us. "Revenge." With that ominous word hanging in the air, Holmes stood in thoughtful silence. Ravensmoor Hall had not just been a home, it had been a crucible of secrets, of debts, of long-buried anger waiting to rise through the ash like smoke through old stone. And somewhere in that smoke, Holmes would find his truth. Section 3. The Echoes in Stone. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to the manor grounds, curling around the shattered remains of Ravensmoor Hall like a shroud. Though the fire had reduced the grand house to blackened bones, Holmes moved through its remains with a reverence and precision I had come to associate with his sharpest investigations. He stepped lightly, as if conscious that the very walls might still be listening. He paused before a section of scorched stone near what had once been the drawing room, now a hollow basin filled with ash, warped beams, and the faint scent of damp charcoal. Holmes knelt, brushing aside soot with the sleeve of his coat. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, tapping gently at the stone with his walking stick. "What do you see?" "A floor," I said after a moment. blackened and cracked. Indeed. But do you notice anything peculiar about the damage? I crouched beside him and studied the surface more closely. Beneath the soot, a section of the floor bore fine, narrow lines, not merely the chaotic scars of fire, but something almost geometric. Scorch marks and a ring, I said slowly. Holmes's smile was tight and quick. Precisely. A pattern of intense heat radiating outward from a central point. Not the erratic spread one would expect of a typical blaze, but an origin controlled, almost surgical in its destruction. A deliberate fire? Possibly. Or the byproduct of something more specific. He rose and dusted off his knees. Tell me, Watson, do you recall Elias Finch's words? That the house exploded like it breathed its last breath, and the bell just before the fire. Holmes nodded. The bell. A strange detail, easily dismissed, yet curious. If the rope had long since been severed, what force rang it that night, and why? We moved deeper into the ruins, stepping carefully over blackened beams and half-melted sconces. The once luxurious parlor was now a skeleton of stone and splinters. Holmes paused by a fractured doorway, running his fingers along the charred edge of the frame. The heat was immense, he said. And yet, look-see here. He pointed to a portion of wallpaper still clinging stubbornly to the wall behind a collapsed sideboard. I peered closer. Indeed, a small swatch of deep green brocade remained, largely untouched by flame. The fire didn't reach this far, I said. More than that, Holmes replied, stepping back with his arms crossed. It suggests selective destruction, an intensity focused not on the whole house, but the drawing room, as if the blaze knew precisely where to strike. But that's absurd. Fires don't think. No, Holmes said softly. But people do. We were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Genevieve Mervyn, her black mourning gown fluttering in the breeze. She moved like a shadow among the ruins, her pale face composed yet distant. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, she said, clasping her gloved hands before her. You requested access to the family records? Holmes bowed slightly. Indeed. Household accounts, correspondence, anything dating back to the last year. I believe they may hold a clue. I've had what could be salvaged taken to the old gamekeeper's lodge, she said. You're welcome to examine them there. Thank you, Lady Mervyn. One more question, if I may. The bell tower above the main hall, who had access to it? She blinked at the abruptness of the question. No one. It has been sealed since my father's time. Dry rot made the stairs unsafe, and the bell rope snapped years ago. Yet, the bell rang the night of the fire. Yes, so Elias claims. I did not hear it myself. Holmes offered no reply, merely inclined his head. As Lady Mervyn departed once more into the mist, he turned to me. Come, Watson, let us examine these records. I have a feeling we're drawing close to something significant. The gamekeeper's lodge stood apart from the rest of the grounds, a squat stone building half swallowed by ivy and bramble. Inside, the air was thick with dust and damp parchment. Dozens of boxes had been stacked haphazardly atop one another, their contents partially preserved by the moisture-resistant crates. Holmes wasted no time. He dove into the papers with clinical efficiency, extracting letters, account books, and ledgers, skimming through them with rapid, darting eyes. I busied myself with the correspondence, mostly estate matters, invitations, receipts, until I came across a packet of handwritten letters tied with a red ribbon and marked in a delicate hand. "For Lucien Holmes," I said, holding them aloft. "Personal letters, addressed to Lucien." He took them from me, swiftly untying the ribbon and spreading the pages across the desk. The handwriting was fluid, almost romantic yet urgent. They were all from the same person, Nathaniel Corwin. The first few letters were routine enough, discussions of business transactions, mentions of estate appraisals, but the tone soon shifted. A particular letter dated 5 weeks prior to the fire caught Holmes's attention. "Lucien, we must act before your mother alters the terms. You know what the old man intended. His holdings are ours by right, not by sentiment. The deed to the land, the vault beneath the chapel, it is all tied to Ravensmoor. We cannot let her delay us with her grief and ghost stories. If she will not relinquish it, we will take it. N.C. Holmes read it twice, then pressed the paper flat with his hand. "A vault beneath the chapel," he said. "That is the second time I have heard of something buried." I recalled the conversation in the chapel, how Lady Mervyn had remained near the altar, how she spoke of the chapel surviving the fire. Could there be something hidden there? Something worth killing for? "There's more," I said, handing him the next letter. It was shorter, written just 2 days before the blaze. "Lucien, tomorrow at midnight. I've arranged for the signal. Once it rings, the way will be clear. Non-C." "The signal," Holmes repeated. "The bell." He stood abruptly, gathering the letters. "Watson, we must return to the chapel, now." We hurried across the moor as the light waned, the mist coiling tighter about us. Inside the chapel, the air felt denser than before, almost watchful. Holmes moved directly to the altar, then knelt beside a stone flag that bore the Mervyn crest. He pressed along the edges, his fingers seeking gaps, irregularities. Then, with a soft click, a portion of the floor shifted. "A concealed passage," he whispered. We pulled the stone slab aside to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Holmes lit a lantern, and we began to descend. The steps wound tightly downward, cold stone brushing our shoulders. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a small crypt lined with ancestral tombs, Mervyn patriarchs and matriarchs carved in alabaster, watching with dead eyes. At the far end, beneath a slab marked Edgar Mervyn, Holmes paused. There were scuff marks on the floor. Recent. He turned slowly. "Someone has been here," he said. "Recently." A faint creak echoed behind us. We were not alone. Section 4. Shadows beneath the stone. The faint creak that echoed through the crypt sent a shiver up my spine, as though the very stones around us had drawn breath. Holmes held up the lantern, the glow flickering across the carved features of the tombs. Dust motes danced in the golden light, and somewhere in the oppressive silence, another soft sound like the brush of cloth against stone reached our ears. We were not alone. Holmes pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes glinting with alertness. He moved with slow, deliberate steps toward the passage behind the tomb marked Edgar Mervyn, and I followed, careful not to disturb the centuries-old stillness. As we edged toward the noise, the lantern's light revealed a narrow gap between the tomb and the wall behind it. Holmes crouched and examined the floor. "Footprints," he murmured. "Two sets, one fresher than the other." He rose and pulled at the edge of the tomb. To my astonishment, the slab pivoted slightly on a concealed hinge, revealing a narrow corridor behind it, barely tall enough for a man to stand upright. Without a word, Holmes stepped inside, lantern held aloft, and I followed, ducking beneath the low ceiling. The air was damp and stale, thick with the earthy scent of age and rot. The corridor sloped downward, and I became aware of a faint glimmer ahead, like torchlight reflected off damp stone. Then came a voice, low, male, and agitated. "I told you we should have destroyed the rest of it." "If he finds it, calm yourself," another voice interrupted, cool, controlled, unmistakably that of Nathaniel Corwin. "He won't, not unless Lucien spoke. And Lucien, as we both know, is beyond speaking now." Holmes halted and extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness. We crept forward until the corridor opened into a hidden chamber. Peering from the shadows, we saw two men standing by a large iron-bound chest in the center of the crypt. One was Corwin, his dark coat dusted with ash and his gloved hands gesturing impatiently. The other, shorter and older, was a man we did not recognize, gray-bearded, hunched, his eyes flicking nervously toward the shadows. Holmes leaned close and whispered, "Stay here. If things turn violent, get help." Before I could protest, he stepped into the chamber. "Mr. Corwin," Holmes announced coolly. "Fascinating choice of meeting place. I dare say most men would prefer a drawing room to a crypt." Both men spun around. Corwin's face paled. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Holmes continued, stepping lightly over the threshold. "You and your companion seem deep in discussion about Lucien Mervyn and the contents of this rather impressive chest." Corwin recovered quickly, adopting a veneer of calm. "You're trespassing. This is private property." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "As is the manner above, and yet that hasn't stopped arson, grave robbing, or murder." The older man drew a small pistol from his coat with a trembling hand, but before he could raise it, Holmes had flung a fist-sized rock from the floor. It struck the man's wrist with a crack, sending the pistol clattering into the dust. "Watson," Holmes called, and I rushed into the chamber, grabbing the weapon. Corwin backed away slowly toward the wall. "You've no proof of anything." "On the contrary," Holmes said, approaching the chest, "I have quite a bit." He flicked open the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among rotting velvet and rusted hinges, lay an assortment of ancient artifacts, scrolls, small statuettes, and a heavy leather-bound ledger with the Mervyn family crest embossed on its cover. Holmes picked up the ledger and opened it. "Records," he murmured, "dating back to the late 1700s. Property transfers, debts, estate contracts. And here entries regarding the smuggling of antiquities through Ravensmoor Chapel. It seems this crypt was once more than a burial site. It was a hiding place for contraband, relics from Europe and the Middle East, spirited away through the aristocracy's network of privilege." He turned another page and looked names. Nathaniel Corwin, Lucien Mervyn, Elias Finch. Corwin lunged, but Holmes stepped back, and I raised the pistol, halting him mid-stride. "Don't be foolish," I warned. Holmes glanced around the chamber. "You murdered Lucien, didn't you?" Corwin's jaw tightened. He was going to expose us. He lost his nerve. He wanted to confess everything to his mother. "You killed him, then set the fire to destroy the records," Holmes said quietly. "But you miscalculated. You didn't know the bell would ring, drawing Elias and others before the fire had time to do its work. And you didn't count on this chamber surviving." Corwin's lip curled. "You're clever, Holmes, but cleverness won't keep you alive down here." A sudden noise startled us all, a low groan from deeper in the passage. From the shadows stumbled Elias Finch, blood trickling down his forehead, his eyes wild. "Stay away from the lady," he cried, clutching a broken lantern. Corwin turned toward him, and in the chaos, Holmes tackled him to the ground. The older accomplice made a break for the passage, but was met by the firm grip of Elias, who threw the lantern aside and restrained him with surprising strength. It took several minutes to subdue the pair and secure them using old chains found in the crypt. Once they were tied, Holmes called for Lady Mervyn, who arrived moments later with 2 constables from the nearby village. Drawn by the commotion and the earlier request for aid Holmes had dispatched via messenger before we entered the crypt. As Corwin and his accomplice were taken into custody, Lady Mervyn stood by the chest, her eyes scanning the dusty contents. "So this," she whispered, "was what my husband was hiding." Holmes nodded. "He was torn between loyalty to your father's legacy and guilt over the unlawful dealings. Corwin saw weakness and exploited it. When Lucien tried to correct the past, Corwin silenced him." Lady Mervyn's gaze drifted toward the altar. "Above, all these years I thought the ghosts of Ravensmoor were mere superstition." Holmes smiled faintly. "Sometimes the past does haunt us, Lady Mervyn, but it rarely wears a sheet." He turned to me. "Come, Watson. Our work here is not yet complete, but we've pulled the ashes back far enough to find the truth." We emerged from the chapel just as the mist began to lift, revealing the broken manor silhouetted against a pale dawn. Section 5. Echoes in the smoke. It was shortly past 9 o'clock the following morning when Holmes and I returned to 221B. Baker Street, our boots still dusted with the soot of Ravensmoor's ruin. I was weary from the night's exertions and not entirely settled by the image of that gloomy crypt beneath the old chapel. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated, pacing the sitting room with swift energy, pipe clenched tightly between his teeth, his fingers drumming an erratic rhythm against the mantelpiece. "There's something unfinished about it, Watson," he said suddenly, turning on his heel. "Corwin's guilt is evident. Yes, he confessed readily enough once cornered. But there remains a thread, a very fine thread, and I cannot yet see where it leads." I looked up from my notes. "You believe someone else was involved?" "Not merely involved present," Holmes said. "Corwin's narrative is too clean, too complete. The confession was too smooth, as if rehearsed. Do you suppose he was covering for someone?" Holmes's brow furrowed. "Possibly. Or perhaps he was being compelled, pressured by someone yet unseen. Remember, the fire was only partially successful in destroying the documents. Why burn records if you've already recovered what you need? Unless someone else was looking for them," I offered. Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a letter on a silver tray. "Delivered by hand, Mr. Holmes," she said. "The gentleman insisted it be given to you immediately." Holmes took the envelope, examining the wax seal. An ornate crest featuring a raven perched atop a skull. His eyes narrowed. "Interesting," he murmured. He broke the seal and unfolded the heavy parchment. His eyes scanned the page quickly, and a faint smile played upon his lips. "Watson, we're to dine this evening with Lady Dorothea Mervyn." "Again?" I asked, surprised. "She has received an anonymous note," Holmes said. "A threat, veiled but unmistakable. It seems our case is not yet quite concluded." Ravensmoor House looked no less grim by daylight. Though the manor's western wing was still cordoned off due to fire damage, the eastern halls had survived relatively untouched. Holmes and I were shown once again into the drawing-room, where Lady Dorothea awaited us with a tense expression and a folded slip of paper in her gloved hand. "It arrived by courier this morning," she said, handing the note to Holmes. "No signature, just this." The message read, "Some truths are better buried. Leave the past beneath the ashes, or the fire will rise again." Holmes studied the parchment, then the envelope. No return address. "The paper is fine quality Belgian, perhaps. The ink is foreign as well. This is not a local hand." "Do you believe it's serious?" she asked. Holmes didn't answer at once. He wandered to the hearth, where the remnants of last night's fire still smoldered faintly. "There are layers to this, Lady Mervyn," he said at last, "and someone wit." She looked unsettled. "Do you think I'm in danger?" "Unclear," Holmes replied. "But the fire at the estate, the death of Lucienne, the smuggling records, all suggest a larger network at play. Corwin and his accomplice may have been merely caretakers of a secret whose true owners remain hidden." He turned to her suddenly. "Lady Mervyn, may I see your father's personal effects? Letters, journals, anything from the final months of his life?" She blinked. "Yes. I believe most of it was stored in the study upstairs. You're welcome to examine it." The study of Ambrose Mervyn, the late patriarch, was a chamber of polished oak and dust-covered ledgers. The desk was cluttered but untouched, the inkwell dry and the pen brittle from age. Holmes rifled through the drawers with a surgeon's precision, pausing only when he discovered a stack of aged letters tied with red twine. He untied the bundle and scanned a few lines in silence. I peered over his shoulder. They're addressed to someone named Henrietta. "Henrietta Marston," Holmes murmured. "An artist, it seems. And more importantly, a confidant. Look here. I cannot live with the weight of it any longer, Henrietta. The vault calls to me each night. And here, if Corwin ever learns what I've hidden, all of Ravensmoor may burn." Holmes handed me the letter. "There's something still concealed on the estate, Watson. Something Ambrose feared would be discovered." "A second vault?" Holmes nodded. "Possibly. And I believe it may be connected to the original smuggling ring, perhaps even to the Mervyn family's foundation of wealth." He turned toward the far bookcase and ran his hands along the volumes. "People often hide things in plain sight." He tapped one book gently. "This one is false." He tugged on the spine and a faint click sounded. The bookcase swung forward on a concealed hinge, revealing a hidden alcove behind it, no larger than a wardrobe. Inside was a small steel safe. Holmes grinned. "Elegant. Now let's see what Master Mervyn feared." It took Holmes several minutes to crack the safe's combination. When the door swung open, we both leaned forward. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its spine worn, and a velvet pouch. Holmes opened the pouch and drew out a gold pendant, bearing the same raven and skull crest as the letter from earlier that. He frowned. This symbol again. And this, he opened the journal, scanning the first page. It's a ledger, he said, voice tight. Names, locations, transactions, hundreds of them. This isn't just local. This is international. His. Finger paused on a name. H. Marston, Vienna, transfer secured. He looked up. Henriette Marston was not just an artist. She was part of it, perhaps a courier, or something more. So she's still alive? I asked. Doubtful, Holmes replied. But if she left descendants? He closed the journal and tucked it under his coat. Watson, we are no longer dealing with mere greed. This is a legacy of secrets, bound to bloodlines and buried across borders. Ravensmoor was but the tip of a deeply buried spear. Lady Dorothea appeared in the doorway. You found something? Holmes gave her a measured look. Yes, and I fear it means we must look far beyond this house to uncover the whole truth. He bowed politely. Thank you, Lady Mervyn. We will be in touch. As we exited the manor, into the gray light of dusk, Holmes looked to the sky. Vienna, he said. That's where the next trail leads. You intend to leave London? I asked. Only briefly, Holmes replied. But first we must speak to Mycroft. I raised a brow. Your brother? Holmes smiled. Indeed, if there's a network stretching across Europe, Mycroft will know of it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he's been waiting for me to stumble into it. Section 6. A Brother's Web. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, as if the skies themselves were weighed down by the secrets Holmes and I had unearthed. Though London was many miles from Ravensmoor Hall, the echo of that smoldering estate still hung over us, much like the mysterious network Holmes now suspected lay. Hidden beneath the ash dot, our hansom cab rattled through the misty streets of Pall Mall, the horse's hooves clopping a steady rhythm against the cobbles. Holmes, wrapped in his Inverness cape and buried in thought, remained uncharacteristically silent beside me. It was not often that he called upon his elder brother, Mycroft Holmes, unless the matter had international implications or required access to the subterranean corridors of governmental intelligence. This is no longer a case of local intrigue. Watson, Holmes finally said, breaking the silence as we turned toward Whitehall. The documents from that hidden safe, names, dates, and locations that span from London to Vienna, from Marseille to Berlin, suggest the Mervyn family were key players in a network far more sophisticated than a countryside smuggling ring. And you think Mycroft knows something of it? Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. If he does not, he soon will. Mycroft Holmes received us at the Diogenes Club, where silence reigned and conversation was regarded as a disruption rather than a necessity. He appeared unchanged, portly, well-groomed, and anchored like a marble statue in his armchair beneath the high windows. A paper rested on one knee, a brandy within reach on the other. Only his eyes moved as we approached. My dear Sherlock, he intoned in that slow, deliberate drawl. To what do I owe the honor? Holmes offered the faintest nod. I require your assistance, or more precisely, your files, indeed. Mycroft gestured toward a small adjoining chamber, reserved for private consultations. Let us speak where ears do not wander. Inside, behind closed doors, Holmes wasted no time. He withdrew the leather-bound journal recovered from the hidden vault at Ravensmoor Hall and laid it open before Mycroft. The elder Holmes raised a brow. "My word, this is from the Eldering Circle." I straightened the unfamiliar phrase. "The what?" "The Eldering Circle," Mycroft repeated. "A clandestine society of financiers, couriers, and politicians operating across Europe. They came together during the early days of the Napoleonic Wars, ostensibly to facilitate trade during blockades. But by the mid-century they were engaging in manipulation currency transfers, black market arms deals, even intelligence leaks. Many of their agents disguised themselves as artists, archivists, even minor nobility." He turned a page of the journal. "Yes, here, Henrietta Marston. I've seen that name before. She was believed to be a central courier between Vienna and Dover. Vanished sometime in the 1870s. She was a confidant of Ambrose Mervyn," Holmes said. "The entries suggest he, too, was a member of this network, perhaps even one of its architects." "Which would explain why someone set fire to his estate," I added. Mycroft nodded gravely. "Destroying the evidence. But evidently they missed this ledger." Holmes leaned in. "And now a woman claiming to be the last heir of the Mervyn. Line is receiving threats. Ravensmoor is not merely haunted by scandal. It is still in play." Mycroft closed the book and laced his fingers together. "I can make inquiries, quiet ones. But I must caution you, brother, pursuing the remnants of the Eldering Circle is not a game. They are powerful, well hidden, and have spent decades erasing themselves from history. If you intend to continue, do so with eyes wide open." Holmes stood. "As ever, I walked toward the flame. Then take care not to be consumed by it," Mycroft replied. By afternoon, we were once more within the comforting fog of Baker Street. Holmes remained at the window, pipe in hand, as the bustle of London life passed obliviously below Dot. I had begun sorting our notes when Holmes suddenly spoke. "Watson, what do you recall of the footman Jonathan?" I looked up. "Jonathan Griggs? Nervous fellow. Pale. He brought us tea the night of our first visit." "Exactly," Holmes said. "But something has been nagging at me since that night. When we confronted Corwin beneath the chapel, Jonathan was absent. And yet he is nowhere mentioned in the constable's statements. I believe he fled." "You think he knew what was going on?" Holmes turned sharply. "I think he was involved." He opened the journal again and flipped to a page I hadn't seen before. "Here. There is an entry from 3 months ago. Griggs' arrival from Leeds to assist Corwin with cellar recovery. That is not mere domestic staff, Watson. That is a courier's instruction." My eyes widened. "Then he may have been at Ravensmoor not as a servant, but as a plant." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And he may now be the key to uncovering the next piece of this puzzle." That evening we tracked Jonathan Griggs to a modest boarding-house in Lambeth. The landlady, a stout and suspicious woman, initially refused to speak until Holmes offered a rather generous tip and a stern expression. "He left last night," she said. "Packed in a hurry, too. Said he was going to the coast." "What? Coast?" Holmes pressed Dot. She shrugged. "Mentioned a cousin in Whitstable, but I didn't believe it." He looked scared, like someone was following him. Holmes thanked her and led us back to the street. "We're losing time," he muttered. "Whoever is behind this network is moving swiftly to clean up loose ends. Griggs may already be dead." "Or hiding," I offered. Holmes considered this. "Either way, We need to find him before they do." Back at Baker Street, the fire crackled low as Holmes sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounding himself with papers, sketches, and a large map of southeastern England. He'd marked locations. In red ink, Ravensmoor, Dover, Canterbury, and now Whitstable. "Look here, Watson," he said. "The Mervyn Journal lists a signal location off the coast, Bell House Point. It's no longer on modern maps, but older naval charts list it as a smuggler's cove from the 1820s. I suspect it's still being used, and I believe Jonathan Griggs was told to return there." "Tonight?" I protested. "It's past 10. "All the better," Holmes said, that familiar gleam in his eye. "Smugglers and spies don't operate by sunlight, Watson, and neither, I fear, do we." Section 7. The Caves Beneath Bell House. The salt-stained wind struck us like a slap as we stepped off the train at the dimly lit Whitstable station just past midnight. The platform was deserted save for a yawning porter who barely raised his lantern to look at us. Holmes, his eyes bright with anticipation beneath the brim of his traveling cap, walked with purposeful urgency. I clutched my coat tighter, cursing. The damp chill that seemed to seep into the very marrow of my bones. "We are late," Holmes muttered as we began our trek down toward the sea. "If Griggs arrived this morning, he may already be gone or worse." Whitstable by night was a ghostly town. Gas lamps flickered beneath the thick coastal fog, and the scent of seaweed and coal smoke hung heavy in the air. We moved through narrow alleys and past shuttered shops until the road gave way to a long stretch of rocky beach. Holmes paused and knelt beside an old rusted milestone where a footpath curved sharply to the east. "Here," he said, "the old Bell House rut. We follow it inland, then down the cliffs." The signal fire from the days of smuggling was said to burn from a crag that overlooked a cave. That cave may now serve more clandestine purposes. We walked in silence. The sea hissed softly to our left, and the stars above flickered intermittently through the mist. Eventually, the terrain gave way to dense scrub and uneven rock. Then, as we rounded a ridge, I saw it, a steep descent of crumbling steps carved into the cliffside, half hidden behind overgrown hedgerows. Holmes was already descending with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. I followed with less grace, the briny wind tugging at my collar dot at the base. Nestled behind a curtain of ivy and sea-beaten stone, yawned the entrance to a cave. Holmes drew a lantern from his satchel, lit it, and raised the weak flame to the darkness. "Stay close, Watson," he said, his voice low. "If our friend Griggs is here, he's either dead or frightened enough to kill." The cavern was a hollow of damp stone and echoes. Our footsteps scraped against pebbles and drifted far into the tunnel ahead. At first there was nothing only the rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling and the faint cry of gulls outside. Then Holmes halted, raising the lantern. A flicker, a shadow. We were not alone. "Who's there?" Holmes called sharply. For a moment, silence. Then a rustle to the left. "Show yourself," Holmes barked. A figure stumbled forward into the lamplight, pale, wide-eyed, and drenched in sweat. It was Jonathan Griggs. His coat was torn, and a bloody gash marred his forehead. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered. "Oh, thank God." "Quiet," Holmes said, seizing his arm. "Are you alone?" Griggs nodded frantically. I ran. They followed me from London. I thought they'd kill me if I stayed." Who followed you? Griggs swallowed. 2 men. Foreigners. I don't know their names, but I've seen them before at Ravensmoor. Corwin's men. Holmes pulled a flask from his coat and handed it to him. Drink, then speak plainly. Griggs took a sip and sank against the cave wall, his hands trembling. Corwin was just the face, sir. The real man he was never seen. They called him Ashcroft. Always in shadow. Paid in coin, gold sovereigns, French marks. He handled the ledgers, the messages. Holmes' eyes narrowed. And what were you? Griggs looked ashamed. A runner. Carried messages. Guarded shipments. Sometimes I met with buyers on the coast. Buyers, documents, secrets, not just smuggling, spying. They traded in letters from ambassadors, naval logs, troop movements. I didn't know how far it went until I saw the ledger. The one Ambrose Mervyn kept, Holmes said. Griggs nodded. He wanted out, said the circle had grown too big. Sighed Ashcroft was planning something dangerous. He threatened to expose them. And he was silenced, Holmes said grimly. Griggs nodded again. They made it look like an accident. Fire, they said, but I heard Corwin laughing the next morning. Why run now? Griggs lowered his voice. Because they're tying off the ends. I heard them say so. Burn the roots before they grow again. That's what Corwin told the others. I knew it meant me, and probably the girl. Miss Violet Mervyn, I said. Griggs looked up sharply. She's still alive? Yes, under our protection for. Now, Holmes said, but not if this network remains in the shadows. He turned to me. Watson, we have the testimony, the journal, and now the courier himself. But to expose Ashcroft, we must catch him in motion while he still believes. The trail is cold. We departed the cave before dawn. Griggs, now under Holmes' close watch, was spirited away to a secure flat in Kensington. Holmes instructed Lestrade via coded telegram to provide protection discreetly. Back at Baker Street later that morning, Holmes stood at the hearth, gazing into the flames. I sat nearby, exhausted but invigorated. I have it now, Watson, he said. The final pattern. Do tell, I said, setting down my cup. The letters from the safe, Holmes said. They weren't random, each one referenced a date and location, but they didn't match until I accounted for the cipher. He produced a folded sheet with scribbled notes and dates. The locations correspond to British naval installations, Plymouth, Dover, Portsmouth, and the dates, all within the next month. My heart sank. An attack? A sail, Holmes said darkly. Ashcroft plans to deliver classified naval intelligence to foreign powers, likely to the highest bidder, and the final transaction, according to Griggs, will happen at a masquerade ball. Where? Ravensmoor Hall, Holmes said. I stared at him. But it's been burnt, only the western wing. The old ballroom still stands? What? Better place for a clandestine gathering of spies and thieves? And Miss Mervyn? She will return under our watch, and with her we shall bring the circle down. He turned to the window, where London glowed in the grey light. The ashes of Ravensmoor, he said quietly, may yet give rise to a reckoning. Section 8. Masks at Midnight. The late autumn dusk clung to the rooftops of Mayfair as the hansom cab rattled through the lamplit streets, wheels slick from the afternoon rain. Inside, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, gloved fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Across from him, Miss Violet Mervyn looked striking in her dark satin gown and embroidered Venetian mask. Her poise belied a nervous undercurrent. Her fingers clutched the edge of her shawl in a silent war of restraint. "You needn't fear," Holmes said gently. "You will be watched every moment of the evening, but it must be you who walks through that door. Only then will Ashcroft reveal himself." "I know," she whispered, "but I have not stepped inside Ravensmoor Hall since the fire. To return in disguise to dance with the man who betrayed my father, it feels—" She faltered. Holmes' gaze softened. "It is precisely because you knew the place so well that you are vital tonight. The ghosts that linger in those halls may speak to you, if not to us." Watson, seated beside Holmes, gave her a reassuring nod. "We will be close at hand." And Holmes never lets the devil take center stage for long. She managed a small smile. "Then let us unmask him together." Ravensmoor Hall stood reborn in darkness, its scorched west wing boarded up, but the eastern facade glowed with the flickering light of torches and chandeliers. Under the pretense of a reopening masquerade charity gala, invitations had been sent to foreign dignitaries, eccentric aristocrats, and known society collectors of the obscure. Holmes, as ever, had anticipated the ruse. With Lestrade posted at the rear entrance with a contingent of plainclothes officers, and Jonathan Griggs disguised as a footman inside, every exit was covered. Holmes and Watson entered through the main archway, unrecognizable in their evening wear, and masks Holmes in a sleek silver raven motif, Watson in a more modest oxblood half-visor. "Observe," Holmes murmured as they stepped into the main ballroom. A court of secrets and power. The room, once charred and abandoned, had been lavishly restored. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light upon the polished marble floor. Music from a hidden quartet danced with the scent of roses and brandy. Gilded mirrors reflected dozens of masked figures swirling in conversation or waltzing through layers of opulence. Violet entered a few paces behind them, escorted by a decoy gentleman arranged by Lestrade, his role purely ceremonial, meant to shield her until Holmes gave the signal. From the shadows, Holmes scanned the crowd. His eye followed subtle gestures, the pause of a man at the punch table, the whisper exchanged behind a fan, the flick of a glove as a signal. "There," he whispered, "near the balcony. Black mask, standing by the curtain." Watson followed, his gaze to a tall man in a black tailcoat, the angular silver trim of his mask framing piercing green eyes. He stood motionless, observing the crowd with a predator's patience. "That's him?" Watson asked. "Not Corwin," Holmes murmured. "Ashcroft." Holmes slipped through the crowd with the ease of a ghost. He paused only briefly to trade coded phrases with Griggs, stationed near the servants' passage. "Your ledger was correct," Holmes said. "They are here. The buyers?" "3 confirmed," Griggs whispered. "A Prussian attach, a Spanish shipping tycoon, and a man from Naples I couldn't identify. All arrived with empty satchels." "And Corwin?" "In the drawing room. Drunk already. He thinks Ashcroft will pay him off and vanish by dawn." Holmes nodded and disappeared into the ballroom's far corridor. There, through an open arch, the drawing room lay lit by firelight and laughter. Her breath caught, but she nodded. They moved into the waltz, swirling slowly beneath the glittering chandeliers. From behind a pillar, Watson watched, fingers twitching at his side. Ashcroft leaned closer as they danced. "You remind me of your father," he said softly. "He was too sentimental, too English." "And you're not?" she asked coolly. "I serve no country," Ashcroft replied. "Only vision." From the corner, Holmes stepped into view and said, "And that vision includes betrayal, theft, and murder?" Ashcroft stiffened, but did not stop dancing. "I wondered when you'd appear, Mr. Holmes. And now that I have, your buyers are surrounded. Lestrade has every door locked. Shall we remove the masks?" Ashcroft chuckled. "Clever. But there is one thing you overlooked." Holmes raised a brow. "Fire, Mr. Holmes. Fire always cleanses the past." In one swift movement, Ashcroft ripped a flare from his pocket and hurled it toward the curtain. Flame erupted. "Watson, get her out!" Holmes shouted. Ashcroft darted for the east exit, but Holmes was faster. They collided, fell, and wrestled near the dais as screams erupted and smoke billowed. Watson dragged Violet to safety. Griggs and Lestrade rushed in. A gun fired once, then silence. Holmes emerged, soot-covered, gripping Ashcroft by the collar. "It's over," he said. Ashcroft's mask was gone, revealing a familiar face, Lord Eustace Vernon, former diplomat, presumed dead after a shipwreck 5 years prior. "I always did like to play dead," he sneered. "Then you'll find prison an encore," Holmes said coldly. Section 9. Secrets in the ashes. The gray light of dawn crept over the charred remnants of Ravensmoor Hall. Thin threads of mist curled along the cobblestone paths and skeletal hedgerows, as if reluctant to let go of the night's secrets. A fine veil of ash coated everything, the shattered chandeliers, the scorched tapestries, even the bronze bust of Lord Ravensmoor that stood untouched in the entrance hall, now looking more solemn than ever, cloaked in soot and shadow. The drawing-room, hastily repurposed into a command post, Holmes sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, its fire now reduced to glowing embers. He was perfectly still, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze distant but watchful, like a hawk surveying the wreckage of a storm. Watson stood near the window, eyes narrowed against the slanted morning sun as he watched constables bustle about the grounds, carrying crates, dragging soaked evidence bags, and mapping charred blueprints across makeshift tables. A heavy weariness clung to him, made heavier by the lingering scent of smoke and the throb in his temple from last night's confrontation. Inspector Lestrade entered briskly, his boots scuffing ash into the worn carpet. He slapped a thick file onto the table. "Eustace Vernon, alias Alaric Ashcroft," he announced. "Confirmed by birth records, the old steward's testimony, and a very telling signet ring hidden in his pocket. We'll get the official warrant transferred by afternoon." Holmes nodded slightly, as though he'd merely been waiting for everyone else to catch up. "So," Lestrade continued, flipping open the file, "he fakes his death, goes underground, assumes a ghostly persona, and starts running a black market operation out of his own blasted ancestral estate. I've seen smugglers in Limehouse with better sense." "You underestimate the intoxication of legacy," Holmes murmured. 4. Some men, bloodlines are not merely history, they are identity. Vernon did not just want wealth or leverage. He wanted restoration. to reclaim a family name blackened by scandal and burnish it in infamy. Watson turned from the window. And Corwin? How deep was he in? Up to the neck, Holmes replied, though not as clever as he believed. His role was recruitment finding. Desperate men and women with access, secrets, or grievances. He was the knife, not the hand guiding it. A low moan came from the corner. The man in question, Corwin, sat slumped in a wooden chair, wrists bound, face bloodied from his scuffle with Watson the night before. His eyes fluttered open under the weight of reality. Violet Mervyn entered quietly, her dress still dusted with ash, though her bearing had recovered some measure of composure. She looked to Holmes, then to the bundled documents on the table. Griggs says they've unlocked the cellar below the chapel. Blueprints, trade contracts, even a coded ledger referring to foreign correspondence. Portsmouth is mentioned, as are Glasgow and Antwerp. Lestrade swore under his breath, God save us. Burnham was trading military secrets to agents across Europe, specifically naval innovations, Holmes said. Ravensmoor was not only a symbol, it was a port in the storm for spies. Watson leaned in. But how did he get the documents? In the first place, those blueprints aren't drawn in cottage kitchens. Through a network of compromised intermediaries, Holmes replied. Engineers, clerks, and ex-officers like Corwin. Every piece of information passed through Ravensmoor, hidden behind fire-damaged walls and ghost stories. Quite the curtain for a stage. Lestrade rubbed his temple. In all this time we were looking for ghosts. There were ghosts, Holmes said quietly, but they were made of guilt and greed, not chains and fog. A silence stretched. Between them, Violet finally broke it. You were right, Mr. Holmes. It wasn't just about gold or secrets. He wanted to rewrite the family history to make Ravensmoor infamous, not forgotten. Holmes inclined his head, and in doing so he brought the Hall's greatest shame into the light. Watson stepped toward Violet, his tone gentler now. Miss Mervyn, there's something you might help us understand. You told us you returned to the chapel days ago, before you came to us. But how did you know where to speak from? That small alcove. She hesitated, her gloved fingers tightening around each other. I found one of my father's journals. He'd been obsessed with Ravensmoor's history. He thought there was more to the Hall than stories of fire and ruin. He'd found references to a priest's tunnel used during the Reformation, and a chamber beneath the chapel that once served as sanctuary. Her voice wavered slightly. I went to the chapel hoping to find it. I thought perhaps my father had hidden something. There. Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. And what did you find? Nothing at first. But when I heard someone walking near the altar above, I panicked. I found a speaking funnel hidden in the stone, perhaps once used by monks to chant during services. I whispered, hoping it would scare them off. Lestrade raised a brow. So you were the voice that frightened Griggs into hysteria? She nodded, a faint smile on her lips despite the gravity of the moment. Watson chuckled softly. The whispering widow herself. Holmes added, fitting then that your voice awoke the truth. A knock sounded at the door. Constable Aldwych poked his head in, eyes wide. Inspector, there's something else. In one of the crates we found a list. Names. Dozens, military officers, politicians, even a banker from the House of Rothmere. Holmes stood. "Bring it here." As the constable departed, Violet approached the hearth, gazing into the low embers. "What happens now?" "Now?" Holmes turned to her. "Now the masks fall. The ashes will be sifted, the lies exposed, and justice will run its course. But the hall, will they tear it down?" Watson stepped beside her. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it will stand as a warning that secrets do not stay buried forever." Violet looked from one man to the other, her eyes gleaming not with tears but resolution. "Then let it stand." The carriage that brought Holmes and Watson clattered over loose gravel 30 minutes later. They had collected their cases, bundled their notes, and bid farewell to Lestrade, who remained to supervise the official debriefing. The morning sun painted a fresh layer of light across the grounds, turning the ruined ballroom into a sea of gold and shadowed dot as they settled into their seats. Watson lit his pipe and exhaled a long plume of smoke. "I say, Holmes, that was one of the darker ones." "Indeed," Holmes replied, staring out the window. "Ravensmoor was a house of embers, and those who dance in ashes often choke on the past." Watson smirked. "You're growing poetic in your old age." Holmes smiled faintly. "Merely observant." Watson leaned back. "So what's next? Another ghost story? Another aristocrat hiding behind candlelit curtains?" "There's always something lurking in the fog," Holmes said, voice low. "But Ravensmoor, that one will linger." And with that, the carriage trundled down the winding path, leaving Ravensmoor Hall behind a place of fire and secrets, of shadows given voice, a place that had whispered its truth into the night and been heard. Section 10. Ashes that whisper still thee. Days that followed the apprehension of Percival Vernon were grey and mist-laden. The very air of London seemed to hold its breath. Holmes and I had returned to Baker Street with more questions than answers. Though Vernon's confession had tied him to the smuggling ring, the forgery of military documents, and the death of the unfortunate Corwin, Holmes remained unsatisfied. Late one evening, after a terse supper that even Mrs. Hudson noted was left, mostly untouched, I found Holmes seated cross-legged before the hearth. The fire cast a warm orange glow across his face, illuminating the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the keen glint in his storm-gray eyes. In his lap was the infamous ledger, the scorched book we had found hidden beneath the false bottom of the fireplace in Ravensmoor Hall's ruined east wing. I settled into my armchair, silently watching him as he turned page after page, his fingers tracing ciphered lines, some of which he had already begun to decode. A lamp burned low on the table, the only other light in the room. "Burial records?" I echoed. "What use could a traitor have for those?" Holmes paused at the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Disguise, Watson. Identities. Dead men cannot protest when their names are used for travel, or to send coded messages from beyond the grave. I believe Vernon repurposed the identities of dead soldiers to move intelligence and possibly agents across Europe." A chill crawled up my spine. "You mean someone is still operating, even now?" Holmes turned, his expression grave. "I believe so, and Ravensmoor was but a staging ground." A sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Holmes raised a brow. "At this hour?" I rose and opened the door to reveal a thin, sharp-featured man dressed in a naval officer's coat. His mustache was trimmed to military precision, and his boots were dusted with dried mud. Captain Gareth Pelling," he announced crisply, tipping his hat. "I was told I'd find Mr. Sherlock Holmes here." Holmes stepped forward. "Indeed you have. Come in, Captain." As the man entered, I noticed the weariness in his eyes, the kind that comes not from sleeplessness, but from long, heavy knowledge. "I've come directly from Portsmouth," he said. "I was stationed on the HMS Adira. We intercepted a signal, one I was told you might wish to see." Holmes motioned for him to sit and offered a drink, which the captain declined. Captain Pelling produced a slip of faded paper from inside his coat. Holmes read it silently, his lips pressed into a thin line. "It's coded," I noted. "Yes," Holmes murmured, "but I recognize the pattern. It's similar to one used in this ledger." He fetched the book and laid it open beside the note, comparing symbols. In minutes the message was revealed. "Fair remains where ash has cooled. Return to the hearth at first frost." "H.R.," I said aloud. The initials from the ledger. Holmes nodded slowly. The same. And the hearth, it could mean Ravensmoor. Captain Pelling looked concerned. "You think there are agents still using the hall?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that the hall is a cover for something deeper, perhaps even a network of dead drops or communication channels. This message suggests ongoing operations. HR is alive and watching. What do you intend to do?" the captain asked. Holmes's gaze darkened. "I intend to finish what we started." As Captain Pelling departed, Holmes returned to the furtiered hearth and knelt by the dying fire. He pulled a poker from the stand and began to prod at the coals. "There's more here," he said softly, something Vernon hid even from himself. I crouched beside him. "You believe there's a second compartment? Perhaps not physical, but symbolic. The message referenced first frost. That's not a date. It's a location." I blinked. "A location?" Holmes stood and walked to the globe near the bookshelves. He spun it once and pointed to a region near the Baltic coast. "There's a town called Erstfrost. It translates to first frost in Old Prussian. It's a coastal village known for shipping. You think that's where they'll move next?" "I think it may be the origin or the end." Holmes fell silent for a moment before turning to me. "We need to return to Ravensmoor tonight," I gaped. "Tonight?" He nodded. "If they know we've intercepted the message, they'll move fast. We must be faster." And so by midnight we were once more aboard a train heading north, the cold wind slipping through the cracks in the carriage as we huddled in our seats. Holmes barely spoke during the journey, his fingers steepled before his lips, eyes closed. In silent calculation, Ravensmoor awaited us beneath a gibbous moon, its ruined west wing more skeletal than I remembered. The wind moaned through its scorched windows, and the scent of soot still lingered in the crumbling halls. But Holmes was focused not on the ruins, but on the hearth in the main hall. He knelt before it, studying its design. "There," he said, pointing. "Do you see the rune carved into the stone?" Indeed, hidden behind centuries of soot. A faint symbol was etched into the stone, a circle divided by a cross. "Nordic," he muttered. "It's a seal, a mark used by brotherhoods of old cryptic orders tied to the Baltic coast." With a press and a twist of the poker, the hearth groaned, and a panel beneath the grate gave way with a grinding clunk. Inside lay a steel box, untouched by fire or time. Holmes pried it open. Inside were letters, dozens, perhaps hundreds, and more documents bearing foreign insignia, communications, maps, false passports, forged naval manifests. A complete archive of espionage operations, stretching back a decade, and at the very top a single calling card, black, with gold embossed letters, HR beneath it, only 2 words, I see you. I turned to Holmes, heart pounding. We've found it. No, Holmes whispered. We've only drawn their gaze. Shadows lengthened in the broken hall, and I felt the past press in around us, heavy, unseen, and far from finished. Section 11, beneath the mask of ash thee, wind had picked up by the time we left the burnt chamber of Ravensmoor Hall, carrying with it an icy foreboding. Holmes tucked the metal box securely beneath his arm while I held the lamp high, casting our elongated shadows across the skeletal remnants of the manor. The calling card from HR weighed heavily on both our minds, its gold-embossed message, I see you, more ominous than any threat uttered aloud. We returned to our lodgings at the modest village inn in Windermere, but Holmes did not sleep. He remained at the writing desk throughout the night, meticulously cataloging the contents of the steel box. I drifted into uneasy slumber, but awoke sometime past dawn to find him still bent over the documents, his brow furrowed, and his fingers blackened with soot and ink. It's a spider's web, Watson, he muttered as I approached with 2 cups of tea. Each strand leads to another, and no matter how carefully one treads, something stirs at the center. Anything identifiable in the letters? I asked, setting a cup beside him. Several things, he replied, sipping absently. Passenger. Manifests with falsified names, coded references to shipments at sea, and, most curiously, intercepted correspondence between operatives in London and the Eastern Baltic. They speak of embers being reignited and something called Operation Nyx. Nyx? I echoed. Greek goddess of the night, is she not? Holmes's lips curved faintly. Precisely. It implies secrecy, shadows, and the unseen hand. These aren't mere smugglers, Watson. They're constructing a network. And if Vernon was merely a facilitator, the true architect is still at large. He held up a particular sheet of paper, noticeably creased and spotted with wax. This, he said, is a letter signed Ma, another set of initials from the ledger. It speaks of Ravensmoor as a sealed reliquary and instructs HR to purge the vault if compromised. Purge, I repeated, chilled. You think they meant to destroy the evidence, or silence anyone who got too close? We were fortunate to discover the hidden chamber before they did. But now that they know we've uncovered it, he trailed off and tapped the card again. They'll come for us. As if summoned by the prediction, a knock rapped on the door. I rose sharply, but Holmes motioned me to wait. He approached the door slowly and opened it a crack. A man in a long wool coat stood in the corridor, his hat dripping with rain. My name is Lionel Farquhar, he said quickly. I'm from the Ministry of Defense. Holmes opened the door, fully and studied. The visitor. You're late, Mr. Farquhar. The man blinked. I beg your pardon? You've been trailing us since we arrived in Windermere. Your boots carry clay from Ravensmoor's south path. Your right shoulder bears the distinct crease of a sidearm holster, military issue. You're not here to introduce yourself. You're here to contain what we found. Farquhar hesitated, then sighed and stepped inside. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, you're correct, but I'm not your enemy." "That remains to be seen," Holmes replied coolly. "State your purpose." Farquhar removed his coat and gloves, laying them gently over a chair. "The box you recovered," he said, "is part of an intelligence archive believed lost in the Great Fire at Ravensmoor. It was part of a covert operation initiated in 1888 to monitor European sabotage units working within British borders. Operation Nyx was never meant to be public." "Too late for that," Holmes said. "The hall is compromised. The agents are not only active, but communicating. Why haven't you dismantled the network?" "We believed it dormant," Farquhar said bitterly. "Vernon was presumed a rogue. The emergence of HR and MA suggests otherwise, perhaps a reactivation. That's why I've been sent to retrieve the materials." "I will not hand them over," Holmes said flatly. "Not until the threat is neutralized." Farquhar tensed. "You're tampering with national security." "And you," Holmes replied, "have permitted it to rot beneath your nose. We have a common enemy, Mr. Farquhar. Let us act together, or not at all." Farquhar considered this and finally nodded. "Very well. What do you propose?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "We lay a trap, one that draws out MA and HR. We will plant false intelligence suggesting that a new cache of documents will be transported through London. If they move to intercept it, we follow." "And where do you suggest we bait?" "The hook?" Farquhar asked. Holmes smiled grimly. "At the docks? The Whispering Wharf where so many whispers go to die." By evening, the plan was in motion. Holmes dictated a counterfeit communique, which Farquhar forwarded through a known Ministry channel recently compromised. It detailed a transfer operation scheduled for 2 nights hence at the Whispering Wharf in East London. Royston smiled faintly. "Mr. Holmes, I had hoped not to meet you." Holmes stepped closer. "Dead men make excellent spies. And yet here you are." Behind us, the second figure tried to flee in the skiff, but was quickly apprehended. As Royston was restrained, Holmes turned to me. "Now," he said quietly, "we find M.A. Section 12, smoke and embers, the grim morning light that followed the Whispering Wharf raid lent no comfort to the London skyline. Gray clouds hung low over the Thames, and the city's towers stood silhouetted like mourning pillars. In an interrogation chamber beneath Scotland Yard, the man known as Lieutenant Henry Royston, presumed dead, now captured spy, sat handcuffed to a wrought iron chair, his expression unreadable. Holmes stood across from him, arms folded, eyes sharp as blades. "You're quiet," Holmes said at last. "A peculiar trait for a man caught mid-theft, posing under a dead man's name." Royston looked up, a flicker of sardonic amusement in his dark eyes. "There's a certain dignity in silence. Not that you would understand, Mr. Holmes. You wield words like scalpels, cutting until the truth bleeds." Holmes inclined his head. "Poetic. But your truth is far from buried." Inspector Lestrade paced the room behind Holmes, muttering. "We've combed his person, cyanide capsule hidden in his boot heel, false travel documents, code books encrypted in some Baltic dialect we've not yet broken. And nothing," Holmes murmured, "that leads to M.A. Royston smiled thinly. "You think capturing me gets you closer to the architect? You've barely scratched the surface." "Perhaps," Holmes said, stepping closer. But your arrogance has already given me more than you know." Royston's smile faltered. Holmes continued, voice now a low blade. "You weren't sent to recover the box. You were sent to erase loose ends. Vernon, the documents, the vault at Ravensmoor. But you arrived late, and now the entire operation trembles. Because the architect, M.I., is losing control." A long pause. Royston's gaze flickered. Holmes pressed on. "Tell me, did M.A. recruit you before or after your supposed death in service? Did you fake your demise to escape or to infiltrate?" Still no response. Holmes turned and motioned Lestrade aside. They stepped just outside the chamber. "We won't break him by threats or logic," Holmes murmured. "But there's another way." "Which is?" "Give him a reason to speak." Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes withdrew a brown parcel wrapped in oilcloth from beneath the sitting room floorboards. It contained the last remaining pieces from the steel archive retrieved at Ravensmoor, several damaged pages, a cipher wheel, and one blackened photograph. He laid the photo under the magnifying glass. Adjusting the light, Watson leaned closer. "Is that Ravensmoor Hall?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "But look here in the corner." There, amid the shadows and debris, stood a blurred figure, barely visible. A woman in a long black coat and high collar, her face half obscured. "She was in the ledger," Holmes murmured. "The one signing missives as M.A. I believe we've found our architect." "But who is she?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I intend to find out. And for that, we'll need to revisit someone we both thought long out of play." The next day, we journeyed to Belgrave Square, to a quiet residence owned by Lady Arabella Blackwell, widow to Admiral Cedric Blackwell and former intelligence liaison during Queen Victoria's reign. The once celebrated matriarch now lived in genteel seclusion, her hair silvered and her hands tremulous, but her eyes retained the spark of cunning from her youth. Holmes bowed. "Lady Arabella, forgive the intrusion, but your insight may be the key to saving lives." She examined the photograph with practiced care. "The woman in this image, yes, that is Magda Arkwright, formerly Magda Blackwell." Holmes stiffened. "A relation?" "My husband's niece. Brilliant, passionate, dangerous. She vanished after a scandal involving foreign correspondence and embezzlement from a naval fund. Cedric tried to protect her, claimed she'd been set up. But I always suspected she simply disappeared into the shadows." "She became M.A., Holmes said, voice taut with realization. Lady Arabella nodded. "She was obsessed with the idea that Britain's decline was inevitable unless it took control of the secrets others hoarded. She believed in building an intelligence empire above law and conscience. I shudder to think how far she has come." Holmes straightened. "We need to find her." "You won't," Arabella whispered, "unless she wants you to. But there is one thing she feared." "Go on." "A name buried deep, almost forgotten. A man who once betrayed her." "Who?" Jonathan Pike. Watson and I looked at each other in astonishment. "Pike," I said, "but he's a myth. A rogue agent rumored to have defected from every major intelligence service in Europe." "He's real," Arabella said. "And if you want to corner Magda, he's your only chance." That night, Holmes pored over every scrap of intelligence we possessed. He found Pike's last known alias, and tracked his trail to a merchant vessel that had docked at Southampton 3 days prior. With Farquhar's reluctant assistance, we boarded a military coach and set off into the night. We found Pike in a ramshackle boarding house near Portsmouth, a wiry, sun-wrinkled man with eyes like flint and a voice that cracked with smoke and sarcasm. "You must be the famous Mr. Holmes," he said, sipping from a dented flask. "I've heard tales. You're hunting Magda?" "Yes," Holmes said. Pike exhaled. "Then you've got less time than you think. She's preparing something. A signal. A reckoning." "What kind of reckoning?" "A fire," Pike whispered. "Not just of buildings, but of identities, of nations. She wants to expose the threads, burn every falsehood to ash." "And where is she now?" Pike hesitated. Then, with a weary sigh, he stood and retrieved a torn map from beneath the floorboards. He pointed to a small estate outside Bristol, a remote manor once owned by the Blackwell family. "She'll be there," Pike said, preparing the final ignition. Back in London, Holmes returned to Royston's cell. "She's abandoned you," he said. "Magda's last move is in motion, and if we don't stop her, you'll hang with her in silence." Royston looked up, and for the first time something cracked behind his composure. "She's going to burn it all," he muttered. "She calls it the cinder hour." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then we have one night to stop her." Section 1-3, the cinder hour. The wind howled like a wounded thing across the moors as our carriage pulled into the narrow, overgrown path that led toward Halberton Grange, a forgotten country estate nestled among the bracken-covered hills of Somerset, just west of Bristol. The moon, veiled in ragged clouds, cast an unsteady glow over the broken iron gates and crumbling stone lions that once marked the estate's majesty. The Grange had long fallen into disrepair, its windows like hollowed eyes, its chimneys spewing a sluggish stream of dark smoke into the mist dot inside the cab. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. His long fingers drummed softly on the handle of his cane as he studied the dim silhouette of the house ahead. Watson, glancing toward the manor, spoke in a low voice. "If Magda Arkwright truly means to destroy everything, to purge the old world in fire, this is where it begins." "She calls it the cinder hour," Holmes murmured. "Not merely a name, but a philosophy. She means to expose Britons' sins and ignite them figuratively and literally, and she intends to do it tonight." Lestrade, seated opposite, grunted uneasily. "I've placed constables around the perimeter, sir, but they won't breach unless you give the word. We don't know what's inside. Explosives? Traps? Armed guards?" Holmes shook his head. "No mass of armed men will aid us here. This isn't a raid, Lestrade. This is theater. And she's already set the stage." The coach halted. Holmes and Watson stepped out into the mist-shrouded night. As their boots crunched over frost-bitten gravel, they were greeted not by an armed reception, but by a figure holding a lantern on the threshold of the main door's dot. She was tall, gaunt, cloaked in black. The lines in her face were etched like cuts through marble, and her silver hair was braided down her back like a cord of iron. "Magda Arkwright." "So," she said softly, her voice wind-chilled and hollow. "The great detective arrives at last. You're later than I expected." Holmes gave a shallow bow. "Lady Arkwright. Or shall I say M.A.?" A flicker of a smile touched her lips. "Enter, Mr. Holmes. No weapons. No constables." Just minds. This was always meant to end in conversation. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, then nodded. The two men crossed the threshold. Halberton Grange was alive with decay and memory. The air smelled of damp stone and ash. Gas lamps burned low, in wall sconces casting long shadows over faded portraits of long-dead Blackwells. They were led into a high-ceilinged drawing room where 3 chairs had been arranged before a roaring hearth. The fire crackled furiously, and on the table before them sat a simple box made of aged mahogany, etched with the same symbol they had seen in Ravensmoor's vault, the Raven's Eye. "I expected you to be cleverer," Magda said, taking a seat. "You've missed more than you realize." Holmes remained standing. "Perhaps, but I believe I know enough to stop what you've planned." "Stop?" She laughed, dry and bitter. "You think I've come this far only to be dissuaded by a parlor argument?" "You're here," Holmes said calmly, "which means some part of you craves to be understood, even acknowledged." She studied him in the firelight, eyes glinting. "Why do you pursue this? You care nothing for governments nor glory. Why bother?" Holmes walked to the table, never touching the box. "Because you are not merely burning history. You're attempting to rewrite it, to make yourself its author. And what of it?" She said, rising. "Is Britain not rotten to its bones with secrets and blood? Is its nobility not built upon lies and exploitation? I will make the truth undeniable. I will cast the towers and watch them fall, all by my hand." Watson spoke then, voice steady. "And what rises in their place, Miss Arkwright? An empire of ash?" Her gaze drifted to him, almost wistful. "You remind me of Cedric, ever the romantic." A strange silence settled. Holmes's tone was sharp now. "You sent Royston to eliminate your own agents, to cut the tail cleanly before the head struck, but your paranoia betrayed you. You destroyed the very evidence that might have earned you a legacy. Instead, you'll vanish, a shadow." Magda's face hardened. "It's already done." She turned toward the fire and pressed her hand against a panel in the hearth. With a mechanical clunk, a wall slid open beside the mantel, revealing a long corridor lined with shelves and electrical wiring inside. Stacked carefully along the shelves were dozens of wax-sealed canisters marked with military insignia, communications logs, field intelligence transcripts, surveillance records from across Europe, all stolen over decades. Each one enough to discredit entire agencies. And in the center, a small clockwork mechanism ticking quietly beside a brass cylinder. Watson's eyes widened. "Is that a chemical dispersal device?" Holmes said flatly. "Thermobaric ignition. When it goes off, it won't just destroy this estate. It will vaporize the archive. There will be nothing left, only smoke and rumor." Magda stepped between them and the mechanism. "You cannot stop it. The timer is set. And the moment your constables breach the estate, the fail-safe triggers." Holmes was silent for a long time. Then, almost softly, "You left a weakness." She frowned. Holmes stepped closer. "You preserved the box from Ravensmoor. You brought it here because part of you cannot let go. You want this to be remembered, even if only in secret." He turned to the table, and with a flick of his cane, struck the underside of the mahogany box. A hidden drawer sprang open, revealing a single roll of microfilm. Magda single quotes. breath caught. "The truth will not die with you," Holmes said. "It will survive, not as fire but as fact, and you will go down not as a revolutionary but a fugitive." A sudden sound rang through the house, the sharp crack of boots on stone. Constables. They were breaching the outer grounds. Magda turned toward the device, but Holmes was faster. With a leap, he crossed the space, striking the cylinder with his cane and sending it rolling into the fireplace. Watson dove forward, grabbing Magda by the arms, as Lestrade and 2 constables burst through the rear entry. Flames flared, but the device remained intact. The ignition never came. Magda stared at Holmes with something between awe and fury. "You gamble lives too easily, Mr. Holmes." "No," Holmes said. "I play only when the odds favor logic." Lestrade nodded grimly. "We have her, and the evidence outside." The dawn was breaking. The fires in the hearth behind them faded to embers. Watson walked beside Holmes toward the gates of Halberton Grange. "She nearly succeeded," Watson said. "But she didn't," Holmes replied. "And now Britain will decide whether to face its secrets or bury them once more." They paused. "And you?" Watson asked. Holmes turned his gaze to the sunrise. "I'll find another puzzle, one that doesn't burn." Final section. The ashes and the embers. A week had passed since the chilling climax at Ravensmoor Hall, and yet the smoke of its secret still clung to Baker Street, like the soot-black fog rolling through the streets of London. The case had concluded in public. Terms arrests made, evidence seized, headlines printed. But in the confines of our sitting room, beside a hearth that glowed with autumnal warmth, Sherlock Holmes remained unsatisfied. I, Dr. John Watson, had been observing him closely these last few days. His usual post-case routine of violin playing or monograph composition had given way to long, silent hours by the fire. He neither smoked nor ate with his former regularity, and the only activity that punctuated his stillness was the occasional turning of a page in a worn leather notebook, one I did not recognize. That afternoon, as the drizzle spattered against the window and the coal fire cracked in protest, Holmes finally spoke. "Watson, have you considered why Magda Arkwright left us that final clue beneath the ashes?" I looked up from my newspaper. "You mean the cipher hidden in the iron locket?" "I had assumed it was her last act of arrogance, challenging you to uncover what she could not destroy." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Partly true, but I believe it was also a calculated offering. A breadcrumb not to mislead, but to delay." "Delay what, exactly?" He rose and moved to the mantel, gazing into the mirror above it, as though interrogating himself. She was not alone, that much is certain. The raven's eye may have centered around her, but it did not begin with her, nor, I fear, will it end. I felt a chill that was not from the weather, but with the network exposed and the documents in the hands of the Crown. Surely, Watson, the documents we recovered were partial. Of the 27 files mentioned in Arkwright's encrypted ledger, only 15 were found beneath Ravensmoor Hall. 12 remain unaccounted for. I sat forward. Could they have been destroyed in the fire? He turned to me with a faint, grim smile. A woman who could orchestrate the deaths of 4 men without leaving behind a shred of legal culpability would not be so careless. No, the remaining documents were taken. By whom? That, he said, is the final riddle. Just then a soft knock interrupted our musing. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a sealed envelope on a silver tray. "This came by courier, Mr. Holmes. No return address. Rather mysterious, if I may say so." Holmes took it without a word and sliced it open with his penknife. He withdrew a single sheet of fine ivory paper, the inked dark and angular dot from the menspot. From the ashes another shall rise. You chased the shadow. Now face the flame. H.E. handed it to me in silence. My heart beat faster. Another member of the Raven's Eye? Perhaps, Holmes murmured. Or someone higher. Someone who allowed Arkwright to fall in order to preserve themselves. Are you suggesting the Raven's Eye was merely a pawn? Holmes did not answer immediately. He moved to the fire and dropped the letter into the flames. We watched it curl and blacken, the ink dissolving into nothingness. "Do you remember, Watson," he said after a pause, "what Magda Arkwright whispered to me before she was taken away?" I nodded. She said, "It was never about the Empire. It was about who controls the story." Holmes gave a mirthless laugh. "And we, dear Watson, have merely been turning pages." At that moment there came a firm rap at the door. Lestrade entered, raincoat dripping, expression severe. "Holmes," he said, nodding. "Apologies for barging in, but something's come up." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "The Home Office sent over another batch of documents we missed." Lestrade sighed. "Recovered from a secondary hideaway in Lambeth. Same insignia raven stamped in wax. But there's something else." He opened a leather folder and drew out a photograph, sepia-toned, torn at the edges. Holmes took it delicately. "When was this taken?" "About 2 years ago. According to the note, it was found behind a false panel." Ravensmoor wasn't the only safe house. I leaned over. The photograph depicted 5 individuals. A younger Magda Arkwright seated at the center, surrounded by 4 others' faces partially obscured, but with sharp eyes and firm posture. Intelligence agents, perhaps. Or worse. Holmes' gaze lingered. On one figure in particular, a tall man in a double-breasted coat, standing slightly apart, eyes cold, almost amused. "I know that face," Holmes whispered. "Who is he?" I asked. Holmes placed the photo on the table. His name was Alistair Drake, former military intelligence. Declared dead in 1887, an explosion in the Sudanese campaign. But clearly that report was premature. Lestrade's eyebrows lifted. "You think he's still alive?" "I think," Holmes said, "that Magda Arkwright was not the architect of this network, merely its executor." A silence settled over the room as the implications took root. Lestrade cleared his throat. "The Crown's asked for your continued involvement, Holmes. They're worried we've only skimmed the surface." Holmes nodded once. "Tell them I'll do it, but only on my terms." After Lestrade had gone, Holmes returned to his seat and picked up his violin. The opening strains of a melancholy sonata filled the room, the notes hovering like smoke above the coals. I did not speak. I simply listened, aware that once again we stood on the precipice of something larger than either of us. The fire crackled. The fog pressed against the window, and in the heart of London the game began anew. Epilogue. It was weeks later that I would receive Holmes' written account of the Ravensmoor affair. He had titled it not by the name of the estate, nor by the name of its mistress, but simply Ashes. In the margins were scribbled observations, questions, yet unanswered, connections yet traced. Holmes, ever the tireless seeker of truth, had left no stone unturned. And yet even he admitted, in one rare moment of vulnerability, that the deepest truths sometimes elude even the sharpest eye. What had begun as the investigation of a fire became a descent into a vast and intricate conspiracy, one that had not truly ended, only scattered to new hiding places. But Holmes would find them. He always did. And I, ever by his side, would continue to document the unfolding of history, not as it was told by those in power, but as it truly was in all its perilous, shadowed complexity. The case of the ashes of Ravensmoor Hall had closed, but its embers glowed on,